No, I'll introduce myself in an Aboriginal way. I was born here in Brisbane, but I grew up in my father's people's area, the Murri clan, down the Gold Coast. So I went to school there, high school and so on. My mother was from the Waka Waka clan, which is about 400 kilometres northwest of here, of Brisbane. I worked there for up until I was about 19, I suppose. Went to school, high school dropout, and yeah, just lived and worked there until I had my son, John. Yeah. So I was born in 1948. And I had my son in 1969, yeah, and lived at home all the time. I came from a large immediate family. I had 7 brothers, 6 of whom have passed on. No sisters. I was the youngest. So I have 1 brother left, and my son is John. He still lives at home. He's been away and come back, but he's come back there. So when I had my son, I still stayed on down there. I never married, didn't want to, actually. And I couldn't find a job down the Gold Coast because the Gold Coast is a major tourist centre of Australia. It's the biggest tourist place in Australia. So lots of people come there from all over the world, really. And our own clan group is only a basically small group of a couple of 100 people, I suppose, at the most. So I have lots of relatives all over southeast Queensland, down the Gold Coast, southeast Queensland, on both my parents' side. So I came up here. When I was working down there, actually I should say, that it was about the time of the Vietnam War. So American soldiers came there on R&R, then they'd go back, and it was all a pretty wild old time at that time. And I have to say, I like a lot of people, I disagreed with even though I was quite young, disagreed with the Vietnam War, and didn't care to serve them. So I worked in a hamburger joint, flipping hamburgers. Anyway, that period stopped, and I met someone and had my son John. And a couple of years later, I moved up here because this is where I could get better jobs, a better job. Although I didn't get a better job immediately. I was still working, like cooking in the big hotels and so on. And then I met someone else. Didn't work out, so I left for personal reasons to go up north, go up to Cairns, because I had a brother who was working on what they call the cane trains. They're little trains, cut sugar cane back to the sugar mill. And he lived there for quite a number of years, and a bachelor. And so he was there. It was a very beautiful tropical paradise, but a really interesting experience. I was only there for a couple of years. My son basically started school there, went to school, and it was an eye-opening experience for me because I had grown up in a place like Southport, so a lot of all of my relatives were kind of urbanised Aboriginal people for a long time, for a couple of generations. When I went to Cairns, it was the first time I'd ever visited a reservation, reserve or a community, Aboriginal community, which was still being run by the government at that time. All the communities were still under doggets, deeds of grant in trust. It's a particular kind of legislation that controlled their lives in a particular place. Some of the places started out to be like missions, and then they became government run places. Got up to Cairns, got on got on the train, the Sunlander they call it. It's just about to come out of service because it's been on the Northern Rail for a long time, you know. The trains in this state, or most states, they're really air-conditioned incredibly. So it's like being in an icebox. They give you blankets and so on. Because it's hot, dry country. And when you get out of the train up there, it's like stepping into a sauna. It really is. It's a steamy, hot the tropics. Humidity is always in the 90s, and so on and so on. The real heat is out the west, actually, the real heat. But it's dry, so it's not as bad as humidity and so on. Anyway, we took a while to get used to that. What comes with that is like rashes, and if you're trying to be acclimatised, After a year, it was all right, but in the first couple of months, my son and I, John, suffered from those sorts of things. Everything turns to mould, and just interesting environment and so on. My brother introduced me to a whole lot of people, friends of his, and we just settled in. I think I forget now, but we were staying in. He found us a place, a renovated sort of shed, actually. Not just a shed, sort of like what do you call it? A fire engine. Do you know?
Fire station.
Fire station. That's right. Yes, but all old wooden place that has been used as a home. See, as a place. So anyway, we stayed there, and I think I paid something like $15 a week. Living in paradise. It really was paradise. Real palm trees everywhere, beautiful water, and it was just wonderful. I got sort of like part-time job, ironing and washing and all that kind of stuff. Sent John to school. The welfare comes around and checking, but it seems everything's okay. So I'm not on drugs or drinking or anything like that. So and I've got part-time work, and John is well, and so on. So they go away again. The place is it was a time of hippies. Hippiedom were everywhere. And so they were all up there growing their own dope. Occasionally being raided by police. I always thought it was sort of highly overrated dope, actually. Yeah, so I stuck to, Scotch and dry. That's what I preferred. But I had this mad idea too of trying to write, actually, writing a novel. Crazy. So when I went there, it was quite a peaceful sort of life, and I had my books, reading and trying to write, meeting people. I became quite friendly with a Anglo-Irish nun, not a nun, sorry, a nurse. She had worked in Africa. I forget which country. I think it was Zimbabwe. I think. Oh well, yeah. No, Kenya. In Kenya. And she had been put on by Department of Health, to work with Aboriginal people. It was really interesting for her, and we just became friends because I was doing her ironing, you see. But she had somebody to talk to, I don't think she got on too well with Australians around about. But yeah, I learnt a lot from her too. I mean, just things like, for example, I didn't know this at the time, but she told me, gee, I just noticed in a quite really posh accent, actually, Aboriginal people they walk differently. They walk differently to Africans. They walk differently to white Australians too. And this really took me back because I hadn't even noticed, And then of course you do notice when somebody points something out, eh? And she also pointed out, which I had heard before from foreigners, that Aboriginal people, they've really got very good manners, haven't they? Much better manners than Australians, which I really liked. I liked that very much. Anyway, I was Yeah, I think she moved on, had to be moved on from somewhere to another region or something like that. I'm not quite sure. But I stayed there for about 2 years. I went to get I went to get a job, really. So I went to back down to Cairns. Sorry, this was in Mossman. Did I say? God, this was in Mossman. I had arrived in Cairns, then I went further to Mossman where my brother was. So anyway, I said goodbye to Cairns. You know, me and John, we got on, back on the car. Somebody gave us a lift back down to Cairns, and I started work down there because I thought I will try and get a job. But what really caused that was there in the Mossman. There's a Mossman Gorge mission. And Mossman itself is the most beautiful place. It's, like white water. What do they call? Like rapids. Only small scale, not huge. Rapids. Coming down this river, coming from or past Mossman Gorge Mission. Anyway, I was. My brother introduced me to people from there. I went there for a couple of events were on, and it just made me. The contrast for me was just amazing. First time I'd ever been anywhere near a reserve, a community, which was, as I said, was still being run by the government, and the contrast with how I was brought up. So I thought, well, time for a move, a change again, and all this was playing in my mind, all this sort of stuff. Their lifestyle. Really, really poor, well, incredibly poor, living in paradise, and no jobs. And that period was the period of Bjelke Peterson, a particular kind of premier, ultra right wing. I think he'd be called fascist, really. That's really what he was. In his younger days, a great admirer of Nazis and Hitler and so on. But here he was, the Premier of Queensland. And they were just running it like a National Party, ultra right-wing, just par for the course to treat Aboriginal people in a really bad way, under the Act and so on and so on. Anyway, it's taking all this in, and trying to understand it. Got a job in Cairns in the Department of Aboriginal and Islander Advancement, run by, very ultra-conservative people, fascists, basically, which is the background, basically, of Queensland government, departmental people, especially in the Department of Aboriginal and Islander Advancement. The name has changed, but it's, it's kind of stayed like that for years. Since the turn of the century, actually, it had been like that, So that was a real interesting kind of experience too, because some of the things I had to do was like handle people's money, because Aboriginal people couldn't handle, under the Act, couldn't handle their own money. So there are things like making sure people paid rent on the wrecks of houses that they were given to live in. If they made complaints about it, they were seen as troublemakers. And I think I lasted about 12 months, and which was, for me, was looking after my son, so paying rent and so on and so on. So anyway, that whole period before I came back down to Brisbane, was just like, well, another world, really. And while I was still there in Cairns, I went to night school, thought, try and get a better job by getting a better education, So go to night school after work, go back to get my, what they called senior level, senior level to finish high school. Oh yeah, I sort of did part of my, what they call matriculation, finishing high school basically. And then really finished it back down in Brisbane. So, and enough to get into university, because the whole idea was still to get a better job, look after John better and so on. So live in a better place and so on. I was always incredibly lucky with rent, actually. I lived up in Highgate Hill, Highgate Hill, underneath a house, a flat underneath a house of a Greek family, who, for all kinds of reasons, I was allowed to pay a very, very, very low rent. Again, it was like as if someone was looking after me, actually. I lived there, went to university. Now I'm getting it a bit mixed up. Yeah, no, that's right. I just went to start going to university. Somewhere in there, in between, I was a chef actually. Went from being a straight, short order cook kind of thing on hamburgers and that, and then went to get a job in a posh hotel over in the city. And I got the job basically by lying. I just said I could do this and I could do that, and I couldn't do anything. I knew enough, just enough to get some basic things done, in cooking. But I could learn really quick. So one of the chefs would make. I was what they called a larder chef. One of the chefs could make some particular dish. I would watch him like a hawk. I'm sure this Aboriginal observation sort of, reading the signs. They're very, very good at it, and I'm sure it came to the fore then. So I watched him how to make a particular dish, and I just made it better than the apprentice chefs. I wasn't even an apprentice chef, see. I was just an ordinary cook, but I learnt really quick and could do things. But I was never good at cooking meat, so I burnt a lot of steaks. Do you know what I mean? That didn't go down too well with the head chefs. But anyway, I can't quite remember the form of things time-wise. Anyway, I started to go to university. John was looked after in kindergarten, and so on. Wonderful Greek lady, family upstairs, she looked after John too sometimes. I was really extremely lucky in that way, Plus, a lot of my brothers were still around, so they were very helpful with everything, all sorts of stuff. Besides money, money, and have to move because I didn't drive at the time and things like that, buying things, redoing they could do anything, so they shifted walls and shifted the kitchen to another part. I was allowed to do that. We had a deal with the Greek landlord. You buy paint and I will paint the place, me and John. And yes, we want to shift things around a bit, like could put the kitchen somewhere else and so on. And so we just did deals like that. Very, very cheap, but well done, well looked after because good carpenters and builders and so on, my brothers. And I suppose all the time, though, I was reading. I read even when I was flipping hamburgers, I'd go to those sorts of jobs, cleaning motels, and that, when I was very young. But I was always a member of the library, ever since school, actually, even in primary school, so read stuff. But I was really influenced by both my parents. She was very strong, very Aboriginal lady, very fearless, not frightened of anybody or anything, would take on anybody and anything. And my father, he was a great admirer of certain figures. He would read, and that was amazing too, because I grew up in this house where one shelf had books, just one shelf had books, and that, I think that was very influential, and hearing my father talk about what was in those books and things like that. So he would read autobiographies. He was always a Labor person, Labor man, and never talked about it much, but always on the left. One of my brothers was extremely on the left, and so at this big, family table, dining room table, they'd argue about things, extreme, left and right, and left and extreme left, and and so on. And so that was really valuable. I'm sure that was where I got my interest in politics itself. Not to go into it or anything like go into politics, but just understand what it is about. Plus, my father's admiration was for people like Castro, for Marshal Tito, but also the Arab Pan-Arabist Abdel Nasser. He really admired anybody who fought against enormous odds for their own people. See? And I mean, I remember an interviewer saying to me once, "Oh, he admired all dictators, did he?" And so I said, he admired anybody who was fighting for their own mob, fighting really hard. So he also admired the Irish. he admired the Irish, the Welsh and the Scottish more so than the English. My mother, who's English ancestor, father actually, her father was English. They wouldn't have actual rows about it, but he would say certain things about the English, which didn't go down too well with her. So they'd have a few words. But so I learnt a lot of that off him. See? So all that was in the background, and always reading, just reading all the time. So I started reading. I'd asked my father once, why is all this happening? Why that is a bad history. Gradually, nobody tells you, but you gradually find things out as you're overhearing people talk. You see. And so you don't know everything because they don't want to pass on all these bad things to you. That's the experience of a lot of Aboriginal people everywhere. So you find out somehow. And anyway, I must have asked him this one day because I wasn't sure how. It wasn't like a direct answer kind of thing. But he was saying things like, he said things like, I think I asked him, why did they do this? And he said, they don't know what they're doing. Which astounded me. I must have been in my early teens or something. And of course, when you're a teenager, you know-it-all. You think you know everything. And of course, I'm saying back to him, what kind of answer is that? What do you mean? They're obviously trying to, they were trying to kill people and get rid of people. They knew exactly what they were doing. But it took a few years for me to understand how he actually meant it. And how he actually meant it was, they don't know what they're doing because they don't know the enormity of what they've done, the enormity, the real moral, social thing of it, spiritual thing of it. That's how he really meant it. He didn't go into explaining it at all, but combining that answer with what he admired, and the other books he'd read, it told me a lot. So. Sorry, there is one thing. I started to read philosophy. Yes, and I don't know why. Oh, yes, I do. I do know why. I read philosophy, not formally, just picking out books in the library, because I've always been going to the library. And I think I'd seen things on TV or something. Must have been, English shows about literature and so on, and thoughts and ideas, on the BBC. Not from Australian TV, from, BBC on Channel 2. So one of the first ones I picked out was Voltaire. I was about 15 or 16. And I liked that. I picked it out mainly because I thought that was a very sexy name, Voltaire. It's a wonderful name, very sexy. And of course, I'm curious about ideas, but I'm still a 16-year-old girl, so a sexy name, because you're going to be influenced by that. And quite often that's exactly how I started reading philosophy. It was just all over the place, jumping here and there, nothing systematic. I never ever, because I didn't know anyone, just reading stuff. But it really did kind of light a sort of curiosity about the why question. That's right. The why did they do that? Why? So terrible things happened, and he explained it, the old man, But how did they do it practically, So, in other words, I was thinking in terms of what gave one mob the right to come into somebody else's country? How did that happen? So I started to read, and I thought, instead of just going through history, although there were history books home too, about the great empires, that sort of stuff, I wanted to know the ideas behind it, that sort of thing. So I did. I just started to follow it through, and my own track. I sort of did it in an Aboriginal way, actually, like reading the signs. I thought, oh well, this is all white fella, literature, books and so on, and I just looked through it like that, and right up to still doing.
And how did you get into that, the community work?
Well, when I came back, I started at, as I said, I went to uni and so on, and I got a job. I think I was studying and working at the same time, so I got a job in Childcare at the time, and Childcare was just working out. It's an Aboriginal. It was an Aboriginal work where it was about fostering and adoption, but the hard times that Aboriginal families were having. So, a mother with 8 kids and, on some kind of pension, and the problems she was having, warring, husband and wife, domestic violence, kids are being sort of neglected, and so on and so on. So that was really interesting, really interesting. At some point, I think I left, went back to university full-time, and then sort of offered a job to actually run this place, to run a childcare agency, the Aboriginal childcare agency. It was only about 2 or 3 people at the time. 3 people, I do remember that. 3-man, or women, all women of course, but 3-man organisation. And without going through all the, community bother, we gradually built it up. We had a good board. We got a good board, and that's my good friend Lila Watson. She was on it. Really well, good thinking people. Didn't even then like the idea of welfareism, and so on. And how do you help to, have Aboriginal people more independent, live a more independent life, but at the same time, how to tackle all these social problems. Play our part in that, and work with departments like child safety and that sort of thing. So all this was sort of like help for study too. Say for example, the administrative systems that you have to set up, they've got to be under European law, of course. So they're hierarchies, strict hierarchies. And it was, and for a long time, it's basically still is, run by government departments, this particular area of work of which this organisation was in. But I was looking at structures even then in a more practical, in a more specific way of politics. So I was looking at, we have to set up a hierarchy with a board, with a secretary, and then you have a manager, that was me, and so on. But if we were running it in an Aboriginal way, that's what we're really examining, it would be more lateral. So I very roughly kind of made up this structure, which was hierarchical in some aspects, the aspects of the requirements, legislative requirements, but in operational kind of sense, it would turn on its head, that is, lie down. The hierarchy would lie down and become lateral. So I never, when I, working as a manager, CEO, and all that, gradually becoming that, never tried to actually be a boss in a white collar sense. I hired later on, I employed a guy so that we put in place a system, a co-managers, really. That's how it was run. So we would share responsibility, and the board itself felt really good about all that. Anyway, worked in that sort of organisation, built it up with my good friend Lila, and a really good board, up to about a peak organisation of about 30, 35 people, doing all kinds of work. Got a very good reputation for the right reasons with the Department of Child Safety. And actually we worked, they were influenced by us to change legislation. So it was the legislation became, what was it, the child placement principle, that's right. What that is, they agreed with us, they agreed with the idea that Aboriginal people, first of all, should be the adopted, the ones to adopt Aboriginal children, because up until then, practically everywhere, only white fellas adopted Aboriginal children. They were just sort of given out, really, kind of thing. Plus, the fostering section was to be Aboriginal families only, but a 3-point thing: Aboriginal families only. If they couldn't find the immediate, somebody in the relation kind of family group, then you get other Aboriginal people who are not the relation. And failing that, if it has to be a white, non-Aboriginal person, well, they've got to be people who are very familiar with Aboriginal culture or have worked with them or something like that. And that became law, actually, So we just really a good thing to have in your CV to help the government, legislation to come into being. And at that time, it was really influential on the government. I can't remember who was the premier, but it was quite okay. But the key thing, we did a whole lot of good things, but the key thing about it was we had a particular view of community development, and it was all tied in with politics too. All this time, there's all various kind of protests, land riots in the street, and we had a lot of support, quite a lot of support. So all that was going on at the same time. But we had this idea that community development should be done in our way. The conventional way was that community development is something of mainly white experts, economic or whatever, going to poor countries and putting in place those ideas. And do you know what I mean? So nothing about it was indigenous. This is, all over the world, in other countries too. But we had the idea that no, we'll bring our own terms of reference and ways of doing things into this, what it actually meant. And so what it meant was, here we are running a welfare organisation, really, childcare, child welfare, family welfare. We will make some people who we put on, who are community workers, but we will say that they will work in a particular kind of way of building reconstruction of this community, this poor community. And we will invite people in the welfare, various clients, anybody in the community interested, to play a part, to be inclusive, you see. Because it's very different now, where what it is now is there's no community development aspect to welfare at all. We thought, that we saw welfare as a necessary evil, but how we can mitigate against that, do you know what I mean? By having this positive, building the community stuff. So people would be invited to come in and be part of whatever we're trying to set up, women's groups, the radio, that was one big project. That was very poor at the time. So, but that Childcare started that, actually, the radio. We started the Murri school all that time ago. Started off with about half a dozen kids. Now it's about nearly, 100 and something, nearly 200 children now, and Aboriginal run, Link Up, which was linking up families who had lost over years, got separated, or taken away, or adopted out, that sort of thing. So Link Up and various other projects we sort of launched. So, and all though with the help of people, not experts at all, us doing it, all of us doing it, and all of us doing it in an Aboriginal way, but also inviting people who are in welfare, on welfare, unemployed people, young people, pensioners, they're not doing practical work, of course, but some of them were young people. So they're part of the reconstruction of the community themselves. So they didn't have to rely on, government money or anything like that. Although I must say, we were very creative with the funds that we did get. Nothing, absolutely nothing dodgy. But we would put on, say, for example, people who would be doing community development work. You just couldn't say it was community development work. You had to say they were working with families, And of course, the truth was that's exactly what they're doing, but in a different way. The tent embassy was, isn't it terrible? I can't even remember the proper date, but it was I think it was in the 70s or 80s or something like that. It was a protest against the Australian government, with the idea that, you see, Aboriginal people are so dominated and completely without power, any kind of treaty, they have to set up an embassy to actually, be in communication with their with the government of the day. It was highly embarrassing to the Australian government. People from other embassies would come along, very, very curious about all this, what the reasoning of and so on. And a whole lot of whitefellas would support it, and of course Aboriginal people around the country supported it, of course. I've always, and it was literally a tent embassy on the front lawn of Parliament House, and they refused to budge. So old activists of that time, they were young then, in those days. I've always thought that kind of gesture, political gesture, was brilliant, because over the years of understanding politics, I tried to understand, war too, warlike behaviour, so in conjunction with politics. So I was trying to understand, say, for example, the difference between strategy and tactics, and when you look at all old empires, they and constant warfare, tactics are more important than strategies. I actually did some research and watched battles. Do you know what I mean? Real, the Romans and the Persians. No, the Greeks and the Persians and the Romans and the Gauls, and but also Chinese ones too. Other old empires. And it just seemed like tactics. You have to think in the short term, very fast, and so on and so on. And Aboriginal ways of looking at life and society and order, stable order, is always looking at strategy. They know what tactics are, but because they're not warlike, so tactics they don't consider tactics all that much. Even though they had conflict, there was always conflict, not total peace at all. But, so the tents on the front lawn as a political protest and gesture was a brilliant tactic. It was a tactic, war, declaration, look, we're fed up with being treated like this, fed up with lack of human rights, and so on and so on. But then, of course, because we're not fully into this warlike kind of thing, we forgot or didn't realise that, of course, the other side, that is the government of the day, they immediately come up with their own tactic, and which was the invention of Aboriginal affairs, really. That's really what it was. While good things happened with Aboriginal affairs too, organisations were, more people got jobs, more services were brought in, and so on and so on. But what the real meaning of Aboriginal affairs was that Aboriginal people will never ever control Aboriginal affairs. They'll never control their own lives. And that's exactly how it stayed today, right up to today. So while we know tactics and we had a go at it, we had to be in the mode of operating like that, and we're not. So we're always looking at the long game. That's what good strategies are, the long game, So, and it's not the game of empire, it's not the game of colonialism and or of empire. I always see colonialism as coming out of empire, a friend of mine, I thought it was a terrific example of it. The film Alien? The mother alien, has all these sort of babies, small aliens, and she was comparing the mother alien a bit like empire, and all these babies in their pods are sort of like colonialism, or different versions of colonialism. So while it might have been good for, I thought it was just an interesting sort of metaphor, I suppose, of how it works. So in other words, if you're looking at, say, for example, decolonisation for white fellows and for black fellows, sort of different, but nothing like that, nothing really positive will happen except growth in understanding, dynamic of growth and all that, unless you do, it's okay, but it doesn't really touch the notion of empire, not at all. It just changes. Everybody has a go at it. It's particular people's turn at this century, another one's turn at another century, and so on. So anyway, all the study, working in community development, working always in the community. I was a lecturer for a while, but I didn't want to stay out there because I sort of, it seemed to me, I don't know what you would say, but it just seems to me it really is a bit of a, what do they say? What do they say? Ivory tower. There's an aspect of it, very much so.